On September 3rd, 1987, Henry Dempsey, the pilot for a small commuter airline, had the ride of his life. He and his co-pilot, Paul Boucher, were piloting an empty plane from Lewiston, Maine to Boston to pick up some passengers. Shortly after taking off, they heard a rattling sound coming from the rear of the plane. Dempsey turned the controls over to his co-pilot and went back to investigate. He discovered that the rear stairway door was loose. It was hinged on the bottom, would fold down so that people had a stairway that they could walk down or walk up into and out of the plane. He tried to secure it, and just as he was working on it, the plane hit turbulence, and it knocked him off balance and into the door. His weight pressed against that already loose door, threw it open, and he tumbled down the steps head first. He managed to grab onto the railings to keep himself from falling into the empty air. He held on, even though the plane was traveling at about 190 miles per hour. Actually, the velocity of the wind pinned his body against the steps so that he could not get back into the plane. His co-pilot saw the door ajar indicator light come on and looked back and saw that the door was open, but he didn't see his pilot. So he radioed an emergency request, indicating that the pilot had fallen out of the plane at 4,000 feet altitude into the ocean below. A Coast Guard search helicopter was dispatched, and the plane was diverted to Portland International Airport. Nobody knew that Henry Dempsey was still hanging on. When the plane landed, his head was just inches above the runway. He had a few scrapes and bruises, but no serious injury. However, it took rescue workers several minutes to pry his fingers off of the railings. Henry Dempsey knew how to hang in there. Hang in there. That is a phrase of encouragement that I find myself repeating often to people. In fact, I've done a quick count this morning. In the last 5 days, I have used that phrase with 4 different people, encouraging them to just hold on through a time of difficulty, to not allow this problem to shape who they are, and to not allow it to destroy their faith. Hang on, hold on to your faith. The Bible word for that is persevere. It's our sermon word for today as we continue in this series of sermons, Wisdom in a Word. The Bible in many places encourages us to persevere in our faith. For instance, we read in 1 Timothy 4:16, "Watch your life and doctrine closely. Persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers." We also read in Hebrews 10, verse 36, "You need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what He has promised." And then just over a chapter later, the author of Hebrews further encourages us to persevere with these words in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. "Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before Him, He endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider Him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." The author of Hebrews tells us that life is an endurance race. And we know that's true, don't we? We must endure many challenges and tragedies and difficulties as we make our way through life. The Greek word that the author used there for our English word race is a word pronounced agona, from which we get our English word agony. And that's the meaning of that Greek word. It's a time of anguish or great agony. The author wasn't describing life as a leisurely jog, but as a grueling race. Have you ever watched the Ironman triathlon? I used to enjoy watching that, and I don't know if it still is, but it used to be broadcast on ESPN. What a terrible race to try to run. I can't imagine doing what these athletes do. They start off with a 2.5-mile swim in choppy ocean. And then after they emerge from the beach, they jump on a bicycle and race for 112 miles. When they reach their destination at the end of that 112 miles, they then change shoes and they run a 24-mile marathon. Oh my goodness. How grueling, how terrible it must be on your body. In fact, if you've ever watched that race and you've watched the athletes cross the finish line, you see how drained of energy they are. They've used every ounce of what they have to give out on that race course, and some of them can't make it across the finish line. We have a video clip of one such man. He fell several times within the last 50 yards of the finish line. Here's just a small clip of it. What a grueling, brutal race. Have you ever felt like that? So beaten down by life that you could barely take the next step? This has been a difficult year. Discouragement is running high. There have been job losses and cutbacks. There have been closures and quarantines and mask mandates and financial loss and fear. Life is often difficult, but this year has served as an example to us just how close that severe difficulty can be to us. Someone once said, if everything is coming your way, you're in the wrong lane. That's true of driving, isn't it? But it's also true of life. Because life is not easy. Life is often fraught with difficulties. These words of encouragement that we read from Hebrews chapter 12 are set in a context of suffering. In chapter 10, the author describes that many Christians living in Jerusalem were undergoing persecution. And then in chapter 11, he listed several great heroes of the faith in the Old Testament times who also suffered in their lives. And then in chapter 12, after our sermon text verses, we read that we should treat suffering as a form of discipline. In other words, we should learn from it. We should grow through it. And in the midst of all of that about suffering, he writes these words encouraging us to persevere, to not give up. Life is difficult, he's telling us, but you hang in there. We must run the race of life, he says, with perseverance. In other words, life is not a quick sprint. It is a long set of challenges that we must endure. I don't agree with much written by Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century atheistic philosopher, but I do like this statement. He wrote, "The essential thing in heaven and earth is that there should be a long obedience in the same direction." He was describing perseverance. He was telling us to stick to what you know to be right and don't be deterred from it. Over the long haul, continue to do the right thing if you're convinced it is the right thing. That statement about life being a long obedience in the same direction probably doesn't resonate well with a lot of us. We want the quick solution. We want the easy path. We love the rush and are impatient with any process that takes a great amount of time or a great amount of effort. Christian author Eugene Peterson wrote a book with that statement as its title, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. It's a book about the lifelong process of becoming a follower of Jesus. He said this in his book: "There is a great market for religious experience in our world, but little enthusiasm for the patient acquisition of character and virtue." He's right. People want to be filled and thrilled with their faith experience. "Give me an inspiring show when I come to church," they demand. "Touch my heart, feed my soul, impact my life." And they will go from church to church to find just that. But they won't walk the long road of obedience. They won't persevere in faith. J. Vernon McGee, another Christian writer, called those people Alka-Seltzer Christians. He said they fizzle up impressively and then fade away quickly. During a Monday night football game several years ago between the Chicago Bears and the New York Giants, one of the announcers referred to a stat telling the audience that Walter Payton had just accumulated 9 miles of rushing yards in his career as a running back. The other announcer added, "Yes, and that's with somebody knocking him down every 4 to 6 yards." You see, everybody gets knocked down in life. The key to success is to get back up and run again just as hard. That is perseverance. We are not exempt from suffering just because we are God's people. In fact, you probably well know that the Bible is filled with examples of the people of faith who suffered during their life. And if we could go back in time and talk with some of those Bible characters who struggled with problems, we would encourage them to not give up. We would encourage them to hang in there and to persevere. We would tell Abraham, when he wondered after 24 years of promises if God was ever going to give him a son, "Hang in there, Abraham. For one day the world's 3 greatest religions will all trace their histories back to you through your son." We would tell Job after he had lost everything and wondered why, "Hang in there, Job. God is going to provide you with more wealth than you lost, and He will give you 10 more children equal to the number of those waiting for you in heaven, and your life will be blessed beyond your wildest imagination." And we would tell Joseph, who wondered why his wife had been unfaithful to him and what he did to deserve that, "Hang in there, Joseph. That child that Mary is carrying is the Son of God. And no parent will ever be as proud as their son as you will be of him. Hang in there." Why could we make those assurances? It's because we know the end of their stories. God knows the end of your story. He knows where it's going. He sees the road ahead. He knows all of the blessings and all of the joy and all of the glory that will one day be yours. And so He encourages you with these words: hang in there. Persevere. And look to Jesus as your example of endurance. Let's go back to our sermon text and look at verse 2 again. "Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith." Jesus is the perfecter of our faith. That word means finisher, somebody who completes something. And Jesus did. He completed salvation by faith when He died on the cross. Oh, He was tempted to quit. You may well remember His Gethsemane prayer in which He prayed, "Father, if there be any other way." But He finished strong by concluding that prayer with these words: "Not my will, but yours be done." Let's look again at verse 3 of our sermon text. It tells us that to consider Him who endured such opposition from sinners so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Jesus endured opposition. The New Century Version makes it more clear for us when it says, He held on while wicked people were doing evil things to Him. He held on. When you struggle with defeat or despair or discouragement, look to Jesus. He teaches you to hang on, to persevere through your difficulties. Let's go back to verse 2 one more time and look at another part of it. It tells us, for the joy set before Him, He endured the cross, scorning its shame. The author describes Jesus as the joyous Savior. It tells us that He scorned the shame of the cross. That means He mocked the shame of the cross. He laughed at the shame of the cross. Jesus was truly shamed by crucifixion. He was stripped naked. He was taunted. He was paraded through the streets of Jerusalem as a criminal. The Romans used Him as an example of what happens to lawbreakers. But He was no lawbreaker. He was an innocent man. But He endured it all. He endured the shame and the taunting and the humiliation and the torturous suffering joyously, we read, because it brought our salvation. You hang in there. We suffer so little in comparison to Jesus. So let's learn to laugh at life's problems, knowing that they are temporary. May Ecclesiastes 5:20 be your epitaph. It says, God kept him so busy enjoying life that he used no time to brood over the past. Or maybe your epitaph would be that as recorded in Proverbs 31:25. Strength and dignity were her clothing. She laughed at the time to come. May God fill your heart that you can look with laughter at the terrible times, that you can scorn the suffering that sometimes comes our way. And may the joy of your faith enable you to persevere. Dr. Robert Schuller was a pastor and motivational speaker before he died a few years ago. He liked to use humor and positive inspirational stories of faith in order to encourage people. He was once invited to speak to a group of people in the city of Chicago. But just before going on stage, the promoter pulled him aside and said, "These people are farmers, and some of them are losing their farms. They don't need to hear your funny stories. And they don't need to hear your empty promises that everything is going to be okay. They need something more substantial than that." Just then, he heard his name announced by the MC. He was called on stage to give his speech. He had planned to open with 3 humorous stories, but he couldn't do that now. He didn't know what he was going to say. He walked out on stage and he addressed the crowd by saying, first of all, "They tell me you're going through tough times." The crowd was enwrapped, wondering what he was going to say next. He began to pace the stage. He didn't know what he was going to say next. And so he began to tell them the story of his father. He said, "My father bought 160 acres of farmland in South Dakota. In the 1920s, when I was 3 years old, the Great Depression hit. We had to collect corn cobs to use to heat our home because we couldn't afford coal. Those were tough times, but we got through. And then came the year of the great drought. We planted seed and we prayed for rain for 2 and 3 and 4 weeks, but no rain came. The farmers of the community all gathered together in one of the local churches, and they prayed that God would send rain, and they waited for the entire season, but God was silent. That fall, he said, we harvested about a half a wagon load of corn, about what we had planted. That night, my father prayed, thanking God that we had lost nothing, but that we at least had gotten our seed corn back. Those were tough times, but we got through. My father had to refinance the farm. And then the next several seasons, the fields were productive. And my father began slowly to climb out of debt until one June afternoon when we saw a tornado approaching our farm. We jumped in the car and drove to safety. About 30 minutes later, after the storm had passed, we went back to the farm and we discovered that every building on the property had been leveled. My father had worked for 26 years to build that farm, and it was all gone. He was past 60. I saw my father cry. Those were tough times. My father walked around surveying the damage. He stopped where the house had once stood. Sifting through some debris, he found a plaque, and he picked it up and turned it over, and it said, "Keep looking to Jesus." My father thought that was God's message to him, to not give up, but to keep going and to trust Him. And he did. My father rebuilt that farm. And within 5 years, he had paid the mortgage off. Despite all those tough times, my father died a successful farmer. The audience was absolutely still. He paced back and forth, thinking what he was going to say next. And then he faced the audience and he said, "Let me tell you something about tough times. Tough times don't last, but tough people do." And he left that stage to thunderous applause. And those farmers left that auditorium with renewed hope. I know you are going through tough times. Some of you are grieving the loss of a loved one. There is a hole in your heart that will never be filled. Some of you are struggling with loneliness. You return to the same empty house every night. There's no companionship. It's just the walls, and they're closing in on you. Some of you have been hurt terribly by another person, and you don't know how you will ever get over it. Some of you are filled with anger. Some of you are bound by fear. You hang in there. You persevere, for your glory is coming. James 1:12 tells us, God will bless you if you don't give up when your faith is tested. He will reward you with a glorious life. So no matter how tough it gets, don't give up. You run the race of your life with perseverance. You hang in there and wait for God. He will bless. Let's stand and sing our closing song together.